Seems like we've officially hit that time of the year when people stop coming to class. Happens every year. I was actually pretty impressed. I was like, wow, we're getting half the class coming still? That's a lot. But it's okay. It is a fully hybrid and, synchronous, asynchronous class, so you don't have to come. Most of the time I actually tell students to skip class because there's something you can do with your time better during the day. But it's a very limited set of things. So if you're in a research lab, for example, it might be a better use of time to do research than to attend class. At least that was my philosophy. Especially since you can just watch the lectures on your own time or at like 1.25 speed. So I totally respect that decision. But just keep in mind, starting week 6, if you are working on a group project, that you do want to be here synchronously with your team when you can. We're not going to talk about projects today, but just as a heads up, since this is the first day where the attendance has really dropped down. Figured I'd mention it. So today we're going to be talking about P300s and P3 BCIs. It's going to be mostly intro today onto the actual theory of the P300 and its history, and we'll talk about the first P300 speller. And next lecture on Wednesday, we'll talk about classification algorithms for BCI spellers and also different types of P300 spellers. And also, just a Zoom check, you guys can hear me okay? Thumbs up in chat or just thumbs up in reactions. All right, cool. I see a thumbs up. Thank you very much. All right. So let's do a quick refresher on the event-related brain potential, which I talked about earlier. We call these ERPs. Some people call them ERPs. Just like how people say MEG and MEG, I just really don't like the sound of ERP or MEG, so I call them ERPs. Typically, people don't say the brain part of the potential, so they'll say event-related potentials, but technically they're event-related brain potentials. And typically these are traces from the brain that are locked to some event, which is where the event comes from. Yeah, quick question. Beautiful question. So the question was, why is the y-axis inversed? So you'll see that most of the time when I'm showing you these plots, negative is going to be plotted up and positive is plotted down. This is something that experimenters borrowed from neuroscientists because the action potential plots typically have negative up. And so that was borrowed by psychologists who now typically also will use negative up. This is actually interesting. You can kind of tell what backgrounds a researcher comes from in a BCI paper by if they plot negative up or positive up. It also just depends on the field. So some conventions, for example, when you're looking at classic ERP literature, you'll typically see negative up. But if you're looking at a BCI paper, which tends to be more dominated by people in computer science, electrical engineering, bioengineering, they'll tend to plot positive up. So yes, in most of the plots that I generate and the ones that I tend to show will have positive up, positive down, but just check the y-axis to make sure. So within the event-related brain potential, there are various different subcomponents. So as you can see here, they're all labeled. This isn't all of the components or all of the potential components. This is just an example of some. We have the P1, N1, P2, N2, and then the P3, which we'll be focusing on today. And a component is sort of this amorphous thing. Is it just this, is it a peak? Is it a trough? Is it just some shape that a waveform has? It's a little more complicated than that. There are a few definitions. So Steve Luck, who is one of the, it's hard to give him a title, but he's very well respected in the ERP world. He has a very popular book, which is the Intro to the Event-Related Potential Technique, which this quote is from. He also runs the ERP boot camp every year. His lab makes ERP Lab. So he's one of the leading authorities, along with one of his former students, now Professor Emily Kapman. But Luck defines a component as a source of systematic and reliable variability in an ERP data set. So the key things in here are systematic and reliable. So if you're making certain changes and you're doing it in a controlled, systematic way, and you're finding these differences in the waveform, and you're able to get these differences consistently, then you've probably located some component. This isn't 100% true. It could be, if you're doing bad experimentation, you might accidentally be finding an artifact, like an eye blink or something, and thinking that it's a component. But if you're careful and you are consistently controlling for certain variables, you can isolate components, and this definition holds true. Another definition from Arbel and Donchen is that our approach is informed by the view that an ERP component is defined by its morphology, its scalp distribution, and the manner in which it responds to experimental manipulations. So now, rather than just having these systematic and reliable variations, which is still true, we also add that the morphology, which is the general shape of the waveform, is important. The scalp distribution is important, so which electrodes you'll find it on, or maybe even how you see that develop over time. So there are some potentials that you'll find them at one time point in the frontal electrodes, another time point in the central electrodes, and then so on and so forth to the occipital. But it could also mean certain different distributions. So some potentials have, they're very clear when you use a certain reference, but you can't see them if you use another reference. Some of them you need to look at multiple electrodes, or you have to compare the difference between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So this is a little more of an all-encompassed definition because we have the morphology, scalp distribution, and most importantly, the manner in which it responds to experimental manipulations. So this is really the key. You can't say you've got a potential or a component until you've been able to actually manipulate it to make it bigger or smaller or delayed or disappeared altogether. And once you're able to do all of those things, you have discovered or are working with some known potential or component. I'll also say that colloquially, when we talk about ERP components, we'll sometimes just call them ERPs. So even though the ERP is technically this larger set of data and the component is only a subpart of it, when we're talking colloquially and even sometimes informal discussions, we'll just call them ERPs, but it's not technically correct. So let's go into a brief history of the P300. I got a lot of these notes that I'm going to be talking about today from an excellent researcher who spent a lot of time in these early days on the P300. Her name is Marta Kutis. She is the former chair of cognitive science, and now she's a distinguished professor emeritus. But a few years ago when I do P300 research, and I was trying to write the intro, or I was writing a talk or something, and she just sent me a set of notes that said if I was teaching a class on the P300, I would make sure I talk about all of this. So now I'm teaching a class with the P300, so I'm going to do my best to talk about everything she sent me. So this is interesting. In terms of the history for the P300, I've never seen anybody bring up this publication. The only person I've seen to bring it up is Marta in her notes. And so this is not the typical origin story, but this is an important first step. So this was a Nature paper in 1964, and this was a paper by Chapman and Bragdon. And in this experiment, they had participants view different stimuli. Some of them were numbers, and some of them were just intense light flashes. And the intensity of both the number presentation and the light flashes were varied. So sometimes they'd be, maybe like 20% the maximum brightness. Sometimes it'd go all the way up to 100% of the maximum brightness. And the task that the person had was to compare the numbers. So they had to see, so they'd see a number, a flash, a number, and their task was to say, was the second number bigger or smaller than the first one, or it was even. And I think the participants actually would respond verbally. So they'd show stimulus, like blank stimulus, and the person would say, bigger, smaller, or even, something like this. What's interesting is that the researchers noticed that the actual response to when participants saw a number was different than the response to when they saw the flash. But it was different in a very particular way. So their plots are not really particularly good, and this is limited by the technology that they had at the time, but also the fact that they weren't quite sure what they stumbled upon. They found that the early responses to the stimuli, so these first bumps that we're seeing right here, were relatively the same. And these components are sensory-related components, namely the N1 and the P2. So you'll get the N1 and the P2 pretty much any time you present somebody with a stimulus. So if I just flash a bright light at you, I'm going to see this complex where I'll see an N1 and then I'll see a P2 right after it. But it's not just visual stimuli that elicit this. It's pretty much any sensory stimulus. So if I do the same thing but with sounds and I give you just a boop, boop, you're generating an N1 and a P2 after each of those boops. And this is true also for tactile stimuli. I think it's true for olfactory, smelling stimuli. So it's pretty robust. It's not just related to visual. But what Chapman and Bragdon found was that both the numbers and the blank stimuli were eliciting these early components, but in the number components only, they would see this large positivity that peaked around 300 milliseconds. And there's really not one individual plot that highlights this, but it's going to be some positivity in this region right here. And this was interesting because this was one of the first times, or the first time, that somebody had consciously realized there were differences between a stimulus that was irrelevant, didn't matter to the task, and a stimulus that was task relevant. So in the task relevant stimuli, we were seeing this distinct response 300 milliseconds after the stimulus, whereas this random flash of white light, we just saw the normal sensory components. And they did their best to make sure that this was due to actual task-related information. So they concluded that larger evoked responses were obtained to number stimuli than to blank stimuli in all persons tested. And they did a lot of further testing to make sure that this wasn't due to eye artifacts, so somebody moving their eyes around or blinking. It also wasn't due to pupil dilation. They actually had participants wear a contact lens electrode, which sounds terrifying. Had never even heard of that before. And yeah, essentially they did everything they could because I think they were probably convinced that something had gone wrong, right? They're like, oh, it's going to be alpha synchronization or people were blinking. But they were very careful, and they determined that this was something that was actually due to the underlying brain activity. So in summary, they showed that ERPs to meaningful stimuli differ from other stimuli. In this case, this was the target, whether it was a number or a blank. And the physical properties of the stimulus don't necessarily affect all ERP components. This part is due to the fact that even in the different conditions where they changed the brightness of the numbers, so let's say you had a 50% illuminated number versus a 100% illuminated number, even though the sensory potentials would have been smaller, so the N1 and the P2 wouldn't have been as strong to the lower intensity, the P300 intensity was still the same. So it wasn't actually a P300, but the component that they found, well, it might have been a P300. They didn't call it that, but the component that they saw 300 milliseconds after the stimulus was not affected by the intensity of the stimulus. And that brings us to 1965, Sutton et al., which is typically considered to be the first P300 paper. So whenever you read a history on the P300, this is usually where it starts. This is an interesting experiment. What they were trying to do was actually study uncertainty resolution. It's hard to, there's a really good paper actually that I'll link in the lecture that talks about the types of research people were doing up until this point and why people were doing these studies. But at this time, uncertainty and uncertainty resolution were linked to information processing. So the acquisition of information was modeled as the reduction of uncertainty to a certain discriminable degree. And what they did was that they presented participants with a cue followed by a stimulus, and they just had to guess the stimulus, essentially. The way that the experiment worked was that there were two different conditions, one where it was certain what the stimulus was going to be, and there was another one which was uncertain, where it wasn't clear what the stimulus would be. So if you were correctly participating in the task in the certain condition, you would always be able to correctly guess what the stimulus was going to be. And in the uncertain case, it was essentially just a guessing game, whether or not you were going to get the answer right. What they found was that if you look at the ERPs to the certain versus uncertain events, when you look at the certain condition, you really don't get a very strong response to when you see the stimulus, essentially. But in the uncertain case, you get this very large positive deflection at about 300 milliseconds. So the major waveform alteration is in the amplitude of a positive going component, which reaches peak amplitude at about 300 milliseconds. And this is how the P300 gets its name. It is a positive going component that peaks at roughly 300 milliseconds. Now, in reality, the 300 milliseconds is really a window. We typically see the P3 peak between 250 and 500 milliseconds. It depends on the modality. So with visual stimuli, it's slightly slower than with auditory stimuli, but it's also affected by a participant's age and various other attributes. So when we say P300, it's really just roughly 300. The other convention is to call it just the P3, and this typically comes from, this actually comes from a different nomenclature. It's not just the fact that P3 is short for P300, it's also that it's the third positive going wave in the typical ERP. So we have the P1, P2, and then the P3. And this is, some people will also use the same naming convention for the N1, N2, N3, N4, so on and so forth. What's interesting about this experiment, well, there's a lot of interesting things about this experiment. First of all, they showed that you can get this component both in auditory stimuli and visual stimuli. They also showed that a similar effect to what Bragdon and Chapman showed, which was that the intensity of the stimulus was not necessarily going to affect the amplitude of this later potential. And it was also the same physical stimulus. Like if I was to, let's say if I was going to say, okay, your next guess is going to be either a smiley face, a sad face, or a neutral face, or whatever, and you were uncertain in this case, and then you saw one of those, so let's say it was a smiley face, and you look at the response to that, we should see a nice strong P300 because you were uncertain about what the stimulus was going to be. And now let's say I show you the smiley face again, the same exact smiley face, but I tell you I'm going to show you a smiley face. The stimuli physically are exactly the same. The only thing that's changed is the condition and the context of the task before it, which is the real thing that's eliciting the P300. So it's not the fact that, oh, maybe only certain stimuli with this property will elicit it. It's just the task-relevant context beneath it. They did a few other studies as well that indicated that this is, it's sensitive to probability. So the less probable, or like the higher degree of certainty versus lower degree of certainty you have, the P300 will be, greater uncertainty means bigger P300, lower uncertainty means smaller P300. And they've done a lot of other studies, which we'll get to. But the main takeaways was that they found a positive going component roughly at 300 milliseconds that was related to uncertainty, not affected by modality. It was also, they demonstrated that it was not an exogenous potential, which means it was not caused by the physical characteristics of the stimulus, but that it was instead an endogenous stimulus, or an endogenous response that was the result of some sort of mental computation, some mental categorization, or some work that was causing that P300, but it was not just this stimulus that I've shown you is causing it. This is actually a point of contention that some people have in the P300 BCI world. Some people will consider the P300 an exogenous component because typically you're flashing stimuli in order to elicit the P300, but as we'll talk about in a little bit, you don't even need a stimulus to elicit a P300. You need some sort of event, but it could be the absence of an event, or it can be a mental event, which is interesting. The component is sensitive to probability, and the component is larger on incorrect versus correct guesses. So if you were to correctly guess that it was going to be a smiley face out of the three, you're going to get a smaller P300 than if you thought it was going to be a smiley face and it ended up being a frowny face, for example, which is interesting. So in 1967, Sutton and team did another very interesting experiment, and they were trying to get at the heart of, is it actually uncertainty resolution that the P300 indexes? So they had this really cool experiment where they were going to show you 2 light flash or 2 clicks. Sorry, I think there is an experiment where they do flashes, but this one was auditory clicks, and they're either going to give you a single click or they're going to give you 2 clicks, and the spacing of the 2 clicks are going to be different. So it's still a guessing task, and you have to guess whether or not you're going to hear a second click. And what's interesting about this is that if you look in a situation where the participant is given the first click and they know that the second click is going to happen 180 milliseconds after the first click, even when you don't have the second click, the participant elicits a P300 that is locked to when that second click would have been. So this is crazy, right? It's not even the fact that there's a stimulus there. It's the fact that this is when the participant would have enough information to reduce the uncertainty of what the condition was, that we get the P300, right? Because if we just had a click and then a second click, we wouldn't get the P300. But if we had a click and a second click doesn't happen, we get a P300 to the time when the second click should have happened. And in the condition where the participant knows that it's going to be 580 milliseconds after the first click, again, we see the same thing. So we see the first click, and then we see a P300 300 milliseconds after where the second click should have been. And in a case where the participant can have the second click at either 180 or 580 milliseconds, they only get the P300 after the latest response, right? Because if you see the first click, or you hear the first click, you don't hear the second click, you don't have enough information to be sure that the second click won't happen a little later. But as soon as you don't hear that click happen at the later time, your brain generates this P300. It's almost like it's collapsed this uncertainty and been like, nope, I am now certain that we are not going to hear that second click. This is pretty interesting. So in summary, Sutton et al. Showed that no stimulus is required to elicit the component if the task would elicit one anyway. And a physical stimulus that is not task relevant will also not elicit the component. So this was from another manipulation in the task. We'll talk about this a little more in a second. And I'll move on to what is probably the most famous paradigm that we use to study the P300. And when most people think of the P300, this is what they think of, which is the oddball paradigm. So in the oddball paradigm, this is the 2-stimulus oddball. You have 2 different stimuli. One of them is going to be your standard, also known as the background or the non-target. And then you have a target, which is also known as the oddball. So in this case, the O's are my standards, and the X's are my oddballs. When a person sees... the background behind this is that you tell the participant that they have some sort of goal when they see the target stimulus. It can be as simple as, just keep track of how many X's there are, or you could have them do an actual physical response and say, I want you to click every time you see an X. But honestly, even if you don't have a task and you just have a stimulus that's less frequent than the other one, participants will tend to identify it as task relevant. And when you see the task relevant stimulus, you will get a P300. So the standards or the non-targets will not elicit a P300. You'll get a much smaller response that might have some P300-like attributes to it, but only the target stimuli will elicit a P300. What's interesting is the P300 has a lot of different parameters, and I'm going to talk about a few of them that are relevant for BCI design, but it would take us, we could spend weeks on just the P300, so I'll keep it simple. One of the most important things is the global probability. So if the target is more rare, then you'll see larger P300 amplitudes. In this case, we have 100 different stimuli, and 10 of them can be our target. This is going to elicit much larger P300s to every target than in the scenario where we have 30% of our targets and 70% non-target. So as you decrease the global probability of the target stimulus, you get an increase in P300 amplitude. This is the one that most people remember. It makes the most sense. It's related to rareness. You know, it's an oddball effect, so if it's more odd, we'll get a stronger amplitude. The temporal probability is also incredibly important. So the larger the delay is between the targets, the larger the P300 amplitude will be. And this is true if there's only one target. So we talked about the two stimulus oddball. There's also a one stimulus version of this, where rather than showing target, non-target, 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 target, non-target, whatever, we just have a single target. The participant is told that this is their target stimulus, and you'll just show, you know, every so often you'll just show that stimulus, and then there's going to be nothing. You'll show that stimulus, there will be nothing. The P300 is still elicited by that single stimulus, so it is not dependent on having non-targets. You can just get them from targets. The temporal probability is also true because if you have, so not only is it just the temporal probability, but if you have many events happening in a short amount of time, you'll have smaller P3 amplitudes than if you had some stimuli happening over a longer period of time. So if you had target stimulus and 5 seconds, target stimulus 5 seconds, you'll have on average a larger P3 than if you just had, you know, 200 milliseconds of rapid fire target stimuli. The local probability is also important. So if the previous stimulus was a target, then a subsequent target will have smaller amplitude. So if you have something like non-target, 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 target, target, the second target is going to have a smaller amplitude than the first one. And I tested this in my own data, and I think it holds in general that even if you keep adding more and more targets, they keep getting smaller and smaller. So if you have target, 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 that third one will be even smaller than the second one, so on and so forth. But in the case where you have some separation between a target and a non-target, you'll have a larger P3 amplitude. So if you have non-target, non-target, target, non-target, target, this P3 will be almost, if not the same amplitude on average as the one before it. This is also related to the temporal probability. So one of the most important predictors in P3 amplitude is just the time between the two targets. But this non-target in between, or even if it's just some other stimulus that's not a target, is important for determining what the P3 amplitude will be as well. So it's sort of a combination of temporal and local probability. Okay, and now this is one of the coolest things, is it's the subjective probability that really affects the P3 amplitude the most. So this is true in multiple different scenarios. When there are multiple targets or non-targets, all targets will elicit a P300, and none of the non-targets will. So I think this is actually something that Marta Kudas, who I was talking about earlier, discovered. And it was in, I believe the experiment was participants were looking at, you know, traditionally female and traditionally male names. So let's say in one scenario, let's say your target was male names and the non-targets were female. And the one female name was Nancy and the target name was David. So you'd see Nancy, 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 David, Nancy, 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 Nancy. Every time you see that David, because it's your task-relevant stimulus, you'll get a P300. However, if you change this to a set of different male and female names, so let's say now any female-looking name is going to be a non-target and any male-looking name is going to be a target, even if you see, you know, like Nancy, Barbara, I don't know, Diane, I'm struggling to think of other old names, and then you see a male name like David or Frank or whatever, every time you see any male name, you'll get a P300. So it's not just the fact that you've been assigned a single target. Any of the appropriate members of your target class will elicit the P300, and none of the non-target classes will, even if they're rare. So in this case, if you have a stimulus that is technically more probable than any other stimulus, if it is your target stimulus, you will still only get a P300 from it. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at this situation where we have a single letter as our target still, it's the X, and we have a bunch of other letters in the alphabet as our non-targets. Even though the X is 2 times more likely to show up than any other individual letter, because the targets themselves are still less probable than the non-targets, we will only get a P300 to the X's and not to any other letter. So the takeaway from this is even though X is the most common stimulus, because it is task relevant, it is the only stimulus that will give us a P300 response. This is a very interesting finding, and it can be kind of weird to digest. So if you have any questions, let me know. But this is very critical to P300 theory, and also when you're designing BCIs as well. So not even just standalone P3. So I'm gonna make a hypothetical situation for you, and I'm gonna ask you about it through class questions. So load up class question. Let's say we take our traditional two-stimulus oddball paradigm, where we have our non-target O's and our target X's, and we're used to seeing non-target. Oh, there's a target. Non-target. Oh, there's our target. What would happen if I then showed you another random stimulus that was it's not a target, it's not your non-target, but it's definitely a rare stimulus. So in this case, what do you think we would see in the, here, let me start this question. Oh, hold up, I don't want to give the answer away. This one does have a quote-unquote correct answer, but again, you will not be graded on correctness. Wait, why isn't it letting me, what? Got the old case of it's not letting me do anything. Okay. Okay. It is live now. So what would happen if we saw another rare event that wasn't a target or a non-target? And the options are we'd see the same P300 as the target stimulus. We'd see a lack of a P300 like a non-target stimulus. We'd see a P300, but it would be different from the target stimulus. We would see something that wasn't a P300 at all, or our minds would simply melt at the novelty of such a stimulus, thus concluding the EEG session. And again, just to remind you, it would be seeing something like a snowflake rather than an X or an O. And the assumption here is that the snowflake is also rare. It's not expected. It's not as common. It's definitely not as common as the O's in this case. But it's also definitely not an X. So I'll give this a little bit. I have 53 people on Zoom and maybe like 25 people in here. So I'll give it a little bit for people to load this up. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions about this, good time to ask. Also, feel free to pop them in chat. Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was, are there examples of somebody not having a P300 when they should have elicited a P300 from a stimulus? The short answer is yes. It really depends on different cognitive factors. So for example, if you're unable to determine whether or not a stimulus is task relevant or not, then you're not going to generate a P300. So this could be because a participant has an inability to comprehend the task. It could be because the stimulus is degraded to the participant and they can't interpret it. So there's reasons from there. The P300 will also change over time. So as a person ages, the morphology of the P300 will change, as well as sort of the time course. So you'll get later P300s and lower amplitudes, and at some point for some individuals, you might just not see that strong response. Also, in general, when you're dealing with EEG activity, it's very subject specific. So because of the fact that everyone's brain folds slightly differently, and every brain is different, we don't necessarily get strong or discriminable ERP components from all people, even if everything else is totally fine. So that can happen. The P300 is pretty robust, though, so you tend to see it in most people. Yeah.
Can a P300 or a lack of a P300 be used as a diagnostic test?
Interesting question. So the question was, can a P300 or the lack of a P300 be used as a diagnostic test? There are some ERPs that are very good at diagnostics. I can't remember the name of one. I think it's like some early component that they use to determine if newborn babies can hear or not. So it's a super robust sensory response. So it's not really dependent on a person's consciousness or understanding or whatever. It's just, can I get this response from the brainstem? The P300 is a little more complicated than that, since it requires learning, it requires some sort of understanding of a task or a scenario. So it couldn't be used exclusively as a diagnostic. There's certain events that would be, there's like some antecedent events that are necessary to elicit a P3 in certain cases. So I don't know. I could think of some scenarios where you could use it to elicit or to study if somebody's capacity for some sort of task has changed or is the same or whatever, but I'm not familiar with any real clinical applications for it.
Kind of on that note, do they ever use it? You said it was kind of like it requires learning to elicit one. Do they ever use it to test the child's learning, like how far they are?
Sure. So the question was, if it's related to learning, do they ever use it to test how far a child has come in their education or learning or something? Not that I'm familiar with, but I wouldn't be surprised if people have tried this. The P300 is one of the most studied components. People study it for working memory, uncertainty, loss, gambling, a bunch of different things. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who have tried to look at the P3 to like school-age kids or do some longitudinal study. If you find something like that, let me know. But I'm not familiar with something that's done that. Okay, so this has ended. Thank you for the great questions. Let's check out the results. So the majority of people say that we'd see a P300, but it would be different from the target stimulus, with the second most common answer being we'd see the same P300 as the target stimulus. A very good guess. All of them are fine. E was, maybe not so great of a guess, but it was a very attractive option, so I don't blame you for clicking it. So rather than getting the same P300 as the target, we get something slightly different, and maybe the students who have taken COGS 179 or have done BCI stuff know that there are actually multiple different types of P300s. So the P3 that we've been talking about is the P3B. We often will just call it the P3 and not necessarily the P3B, but if you're trying to be careful, you'll say it's the P3B. And this is elicited from task-relevant stimuli. It's what we've been talking about this whole time. And typically you see it at centroparietal electrodes, typically around CPZ and PZ. So these are towards the back of the head, but not all the way down. This also is in that same time course. We'll usually see it roughly at around 400 milliseconds on visual stimuli and a little earlier on auditory. The P3A is elicited from rare but task-irrelevant stimuli. So in this case, our little snowflake would give us a P3A. It's not typically what people are talking about when they talk about the P300 or the P3, but it is one of the components that's generated in a P3 complex. So in certain tasks, you'll get stimuli that elicit not only a P3. So for example, the oddball task doesn't just elicit a P3, it also elicits, a bunch of other components, and it can elicit a P3A in some situations. But the P3A can be distinguished from the P3B both by its actual scalp distribution. So typically we'll see this maximal at the frontocentral site, so FZ and FCZ, and it also peaks earlier than the P3B. So you'll see the P3A first, and then you'll see the P3B. And there are potentially many other P300 subcomponents. These are just the ones that are definitely 100% a thing, but there are many others that people think might be a variation of one of these or a different component, including the feedback negativity or the reward positivity, and also the error positivity. Now, the error positivity is particularly cool because that shows up as a positive deflection 300 milliseconds after you make an error. And people have always associated it with error processing. But this one paper by Donchin and Arbol in 2009, they showed that, or they demonstrated potentially that what that positivity is actually a P300 to the elicitation of the error. So it's not it's not you making the error. It's your brain's ability to like understand that what you did was made an error, and that understanding is what elicits the P300, which is awesome. So that is a P3 that is locked to a mental computation, in theory. This is the current working hypothesis. But there are many other potential P3 subcomponents and things that look like they could be P300s. But okay, now we have a little bit of understanding of the P3B, so let's take what we know and try to make the simplest BCI that we could possibly make. So let's create a BCI speller, and in this case, a speller is any device that you use to spell a word or letters or sentences using the brain. It's a very common category of BCIs. So let's follow this 7-step procedure. So we'll have the user think of a word. We'll have the user spell that word one letter at a time, and what we'll do is we're going to use a monitor and we're going to show participants every letter in the alphabet one at a time. So let's say you're trying to spell the word hi. You know, your first letter that you're thinking of is H, and then what we're going to do is we're going to show you A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way through all the letters, and when they see a non-target, we shouldn't really see a response, but when they see their actual target letter, we should expect to see a P3B. Now, this whole time I've been talking about this as if we're seeing this really nice, clear waveform from single stimuli. That's not the case. Typically, we only see this giant P300 amplitude as we average multiple stimuli together. So it's not just one target is going to give you this massive P300. This would be like if you've seen 5 targets and you average them all together, or 10 targets, or 90 or 100 or whatever. We should see a clearer and clearer P300. So let's, in this case, say that because we can't get it just from a single trial, that we're going to show every single letter in the alphabet 5 times. Then we'll compute the average, and we're going to look for the P3B, and that should be our letter. And then we can repeat this for every letter until the subject spells the word. So this is a very simple procedure. Just show a participant every single letter in the alphabet multiple times, look at their EEG activity, and we can just look at this manually and just be like, that's the letter they were thinking about. So we expect to see the P3 between 300 and 600 milliseconds. So let's say that we're going to therefore show one letter every 600 milliseconds. This means that we could show every letter in about 15 seconds, and if we do 5 repetitions, that takes 78 seconds for a single letter to be spelled. The average English word has 4.7 letters in it, so it would on average take us about 6 minutes to spell a single word. So that's really, really slow. But let's say you have no ability to communicate otherwise. That's not bad, right? 6 minutes is a lot better than never. But let's think about how we might be able to do better. So are there any ideas on how we could do better than just showing every single letter one at a time rather slowly? There's just, yeah. Sure, so that's a really good suggestion. So the suggestion was maybe once they start spelling a couple letters, we sort of see, start making guesses on what the word is going to be, and we start showing targets that are more likely to be the correct letter first. That's a very good idea. That's an idea that people, including me, have done, so it's good. So in chat we see show common words instead of letters. That's also a good suggestion. Binary search is also good. This is assuming that we can, find the P3 amplitude somewhat automatically. But these are good responses, and all of these are things that people have tried, which we'll talk about in the coming week. But I want to talk about the first BCI speller real quick, which is the matrix or grid speller. So this was, and probably is, the most famous BCI speller that's ever been made, which is the Farwell and Donchen's Talking Off the Top of Your Head, which is one of the coolest titles because it tells you what it's going to be about right away. And this was all the way back in 1988. So this was the first BCI speller. And what they had was, rather than showing a single letter, so we'd call this a serial presentation, they showed multiple letters, or commands in this case, at the same time. So I have a little video that is actually a GIF that I had to turn into a video. showing a similar type of matrix speller. So in this case, an entire row or an entire column is illuminated. And this way, if a participant is looking at a single letter, let's say they're looking at the letter O, and let's say they're keeping track of every time they see the letter O flash by just keeping a mental count, every time the row containing O and the column containing O are flashed, you should get a P300. And what we can do is we can look at the responses to every individual row and every individual column, and the row and the column that have a P300, where they intersect is where the letter the participant was looking at is. And when I say looking at, what I really mean is the letter that the participant had as their target. Because the way that they designed this experiment originally, the participant was able to look at all of the stimuli without actually moving their eyes. So they could just get it from looking at the entire screen. Sorry, here is somebody trying to say something in chat in Zoom? Could have sworn I heard something. All right. So this is a very typical, very popular speller design that people have replicated many times. It's very often a first starting place if you're trying to make a new P300 speller. You just start with this and see if you can get that working. Sorry, videos play weirdly. So yeah, like I said, they'd illuminate entire rows or entire columns, and where they intersect and get the P300 is where we would see the actual target stimulus. What's interesting from this paper is that they actually did a lot of things that are still somewhat popular today. The classifier, for example, they tried a bunch of different methods to see how they could find the P300 best. They used a variation approach. They used a simple summation approach to say the potentials, the sum of these points. They also used stepwise discriminant analysis, which is very similar to linear discriminant analysis, which we'll talk about on Wednesday, and what is still used in P3 spellers today. And they also showed that you can get pretty good response, if not better response and classification accuracy by having faster stimuli. So in this case, ISI stands for interstimulus interval, so the amount of time between two stimuli. And this graph doesn't show it. I think this one does, yes. When you have the actual faster condition, at least for some subjects, it is exclusively better and faster than if you have slower stimuli. But even in the case where they're roughly equal, you can spell a lot more quickly if you have a shorter interval between stimuli than if you have a longer one. And in fact, this same methodology is still extended into BCIs today, where oftentimes you'll have components that are somewhat overlapping. So you'll present a new stimulus even though you should be seeing, so like, let's say I see the P300 end at about 500 milliseconds. There are paradigms, including one that I've used, that will show another stimulus before that P300 has even resolved. So you can even have these overlapping stimuli to try to get it really, really fast and still get this strong P300 response. So we are about out of time. This is where we'll end today. I briefly wanted to just talk about, so we'll talk about P3 spellers and classification on Wednesday. I wanted to talk a little bit about some homework logistics. I went through Piazza this morning. Typically, me and the TAs are not going to check it during the weekends, but I appreciate you guys contributing to each other's learning and logistics on there yourselves. The main thing is that EEG lab downloading at the end, as a student pointed out, won't work unless you restart the kernel and then execute the last line. You could also execute this in the terminal. And then for homework 2, I forgot to include a data file that was necessary to load the data. So I've now uploaded that and it should work. I will be checking Piazza all today and all this week, so keep your questions coming in. Thank you very much for the students who were chiming in and helping each other out. Really appreciate that. And but yeah, we'll be active on it throughout the week. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday.